and welcome. Today we're learning about Westward Movement and Native Americans. This study island topic is covered in 2 videos. This is part 1. Okay, let's begin learning about America's westward expansion during the 1800s. America fought England for independence in part because England was not allowing American citizens to move onto western lands. The King of England issued a royal proclamation in 1763 which drew an invisible line separating the English colonies from Indian territories. This proclamation line prohibited settlement to the west of it. We see the line here in dark blue. And everything in the dark orangish color was the English colonies, while everything in the light orange salmony color was Indian land and off limits to colonists. Because England had just fought a costly war against the French, which was known as the 7 Years' War in Europe and the French and Indian War in America. It was the same war, just had 2 different names. As a result, they did not want to continue spending money fighting Native American tribes. This proclamation line upset many Americans, including George Washington. In 1776, American independence was gained, and then, fueled by the idea of manifest destiny, American citizens made quick work of moving on to western lands. If you study history, you'll see that imaginary lines on maps typically do not lead to happy times. Manifest destiny was the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It was a widely held belief by Americans, and one of the main arguments behind it was because America held special virtues, or that is to say, America and Americans were doing things in a unique and correct manner and should therefore expand. Another argument for manifest destiny was that Americans would farm the western lands, which was considered proper use of those lands. Of course, the problem with manifest destiny was that the western lands were not sitting vacant, available for the taking. By 1830, Americans had pushed west of the proclamation line and primarily resided in this area. But as some of you learned in the immigration session, the American population was growing and it needed more land, so the call to move west became louder and louder. The Cherokee were in Georgia and Tennessee, the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw were in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The Seminole were in Florida, the Navajo in Arizona, the Sioux were in the Dakotas, and so forth and so on. North American lands were inhabited by Native Americans. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase fanned the flames of westward expansion because it theoretically opened up lands for white settlers to move west and because it provided a new home for the tribes who were still east of the Mississippi. The Indians were considered in the way of progress and expansion. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. It was a law designed to force the removal of all tribes still residing east of the Mississippi and within existing state borders. The 5 civilized tribes were particularly targeted for removal. They were considered civilized because they acted much like their white counterparts. They operated plantations, ferries, and other businesses. They dressed in suits rather than buffalo skins. They lived in homes instead of teepees. And their children went to school, some of them achieving college educations. A few even grew up to become lawyers who fought with their tribes to remain on their ancestral homelands, taking cases through the U.S. judicial system all the way to the Supreme Court. One such case that made it to the Supreme Court was Worcester versus Georgia. Samuel Worcester was a minister who was white and lived and worked with the Cherokee people. He was friends with Cherokee leaders and had become influential among them. The state of Georgia passed a law saying white people could not live with Native Americans without permission from the state of Georgia. Worcester didn't heed the law and didn't move off of the reservation, stayed with his friends, and he was arrested by the state of Georgia and thrown in jail. So his case made it to the Supreme Court, and at the time, John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall and the court found in Worcester's favor, saying the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction over the Cherokee. However, Georgia did not set the prisoners free, and to further complicate matters, President Jackson did not send or even threaten to send federal troops to force Georgia's compliance with the court's decision. Instead, he is rumored to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." It's important to understand why this was such a big deal. America was a new nation. Her brand of democracy was experimental. The North and South were already set against each other on the issue of slavery, and sending federal troops could have spiraled the nation into civil war. And although we know with the benefit of hindsight that it was not, in 1830 many Americans believed that civil war was avoidable. So the balance of power designed by our founding fathers was disrupted with the Worcester versus Georgia case when the state of Georgia and the executive branch completely ignored the Supreme Court's decision. As a result, Indian removal followed soon after, with tribe after tribe being relocated west of the Mississippi River. The Trail of Tears was a 10-year ordeal that began with the forced removal of the Choctaw tribe and culminated with the Cherokee removal, during which approximately 4,000 died due to disease, starvation, and exposure to cold weather. Alexis De Tocqueville was a French sociologist and political theorist who traveled throughout America in the mid-1800s. He wrote in his book, Democracy in America, about a time during those travels when he encountered a group of Choctaw on their Trail of Tears. What follows are his own words describing the experience. At the end of the year 1831, while I was on the left bank of the Mississippi, at a place named by Europeans Memphis, there arrived a numerous band of Choctaws. These savages had left their country and were endeavoring to gain the right bank of the Mississippi, where they hoped to find an asylum that had been promised them by the American government. It was then the middle of winter, and the cold was unusually severe. The snow had frozen hard up on the ground, and the river was drifting huge masses of ice. The Indians had their families with them, and they brought in their train the wounded and the sick, with children newly born and old men on the verge of death. They possessed neither tents nor wagons, but only their arms and some provisions. I saw them embark to pass the mighty river, and never will that solemn spectacle fade from my remembrance. No cry, no sob was heard among the assembled crowd. All were silent. Their calamities were of an ancient date, and they knew them to be irremediable. The Indians had all stepped into the bark that was to carry them across the river, but their dogs remained upon the bank. As soon as these animals perceived that their masters were finally leaving the shore, they set up a dismal howl, and plunging all together into the icy waters of the Mississippi, swam after the boat. These Native Americans were on their way to Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory. They packed up the belongings they could carry and walked a large part of the journey. There weren't enough boats for comfortably crossing the mighty Mississippi, and often things were left on the bank, even cherished things such as pets. This concludes part 1. Please continue to part 2.